Before we get started with today's video, I wanted to remind everybody that tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, the brand new, incredible election night, will be uploaded tomorrow on the channel. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Now let's get into today's video. Hello everybody and welcome back to another 2020 U.S. Senate forecast. It's been a little over 3 weeks since I last updated the 2020 Senate map for you guys, so it is very long overdue. A lot has happened regarding polls and political happenings across the country, so we have a lot of updates to go through today. But starting out, let's label all of these safe states for both parties, starting out with the Republicans in Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, and West Virginia. These are all of these safe states for the Republican Party in the 2020 U.S. Senate elections. Now, as for the Democrats in Oregon, in New Mexico, in Illinois, as well as Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and the state of Delaware. So these are all of these safe states for the Republican Party, for the Democratic Party rather, in the 2020 Senate elections. Now moving on to the likely states for the Democratic Party. In Minnesota, Tina Smith, the Democratic incumbent, is more than likely going to secure her seat in the 2020 elections in November, as is Mark Warner in the state of Virginia and Jeanne Shaheen in New Hampshire. These are all, in all likelihood, going to go to the Democratic Party by good margins. These are all not unpopular incumbent Democrats in states that are expected to go to the Democratic Party, although a little bit more competitive than the states of such as Oregon or Illinois or Massachusetts are trending more blue and likely to go to the Democratic Party in both the presidential election and the Senate elections there. Now, as for the likely states for the Republican Party, there's really only one state that I would label maybe borderline two, the state of Kentucky and South Carolina. Now, Kentucky, there's obviously a lot happening in the state of Kentucky right now regarding the Kentucky Senate Democratic primary between Amy McGrath and Charles Booker. Right now, as I'm recording this video, it is looking more and more likely that Charles Booker will defeat Amy McGrath in that Kentucky Senate race and thus face Mitch McConnell in the general election. Now, having said that, how competitive really is the state of Kentucky? Obviously, Mitch McConnell is criminally unpopular. It's honestly quite ridiculous how unpopular Mitch McConnell is, not just in the state of Kentucky, but nationwide. Now, how competitive is the state of Kentucky, though, in a general election year with Donald Trump on the ticket? Not very, in my personal opinion. However, I do believe that you could probably label it as more of a lean state, and so I'm going to leave it as gray for now. However, the state of South Carolina I would label as a likely state for the Republican Party. The Democrat there, Jamie Harrison, has had a lot of attention, national media attention, and money flow into his campaign in an attempt to unseat Republican incumbent Lindsey Graham. However, it looks increasingly unlikely that he will be able to do so in a presidential election year in a state like South Carolina that will in all likelihood go to Donald Trump by likely margins. Now, as for the states that I would label as lean for the Republican Party, there are quite a few. I would label the state of Kansas lean, the state of Texas as well, Alabama as well, and Kentucky, along with Georgia's Senate election, not the special election, but their Senate election between David Perdue and Jon Ossoff. Now, going through all of these races one by one, the state of Kansas, Secretary of State Republican Chris Kobach, or Kansas Secretary of State, not national or U.S. Secretary of State, but Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach will be the Republican candidate. He's not very popular in the state of Kansas, and thus it is actually a lot more competitive there than you would initially anticipate in a state as deep red as Kansas. Now, on the Democratic side, there's Barbara Boilet, who, leaving the Republican Party in 2018, is now running as a Democrat against Chris Kobach. Polls have these two candidates neck and neck. However, is it really realistic that the Democrat could be pushed over the edge in a presidential election year in a state like Kansas that is expected to go to Donald Trump by around 20 points in the general election? Now, that is why this race is considered as a lean in favor of the Republican Party. Otherwise, you could make the argument that it would be an effective toss-up. Now, as for the state of Texas, formerly I labeled the state of Texas as a likely in favor of the Republican candidate John Cornyn in the incumbent Republican John Cornyn in the state of Texas against the likely Democratic candidate MJ Hagar. Now, recent polls coming out in the state of Texas have shown that a hypothetical Democratic candidate in the state of Texas is really within the margin of error with John Cornyn. Now, whether or not that will actually hold true once we get closer and closer to the general election, especially considering the fact that John Cornyn is a nationally recognized senator and one that isn't necessarily extremely unpopular in the state of Texas. And not to mention that although the state of Texas will be close in the 2020 presidential election, or rather closer than in recent years between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I do believe that John Cornyn will actually outperform Donald Trump in the state of Texas. At least that is what all of the polling data there is suggesting. Now moving on to the state of Alabama. Alabama, the Democratic incumbent Doug Jones is looking very unlikely to be able to hold on to his seat, whether he faces Republican Jeff Sessions or Tommy Tuberville. Right now it's looking more like Tommy Tuberville will come out on top in the Republican primary there. However, either way, I do believe that Doug Jones is in serious trouble of holding on to his seat in the state of Alabama, and that is why I label it as a lean in favor of the Republican Party. As for the state of Georgia, we have Republican incumbent David Perdue facing off against Democrat Jon Ossoff. Now, Jon Ossoff was in the midst of one of the most highly funded congressional race in 2018. However, he did lose. Now, saying that he did receive a lot of national media attention and is picking up steam rather in polls and fundraising heading into the general election, or heading into the final months before the general election. However, to say that David Perdue, the incumbent Republican, who's not necessarily unpopular, will lose this race is probably very unlikely. I do believe he'll win in this somewhere in the margin of 3 to 5, maybe 6 points in the state of Georgia, even though the state of Georgia I expect to be very close in the 2020 presidential election. Now, the state of Kentucky I went over already before. I label it as a lean because we don't yet know who the Democratic candidate is, and whether or not, obviously, Amy McGrath is the fundraising powerhouse and the corporate and more establishment Democratic candidate that they have sort of rallied behind to unseat Mitch McConnell. Now, on the other hand, we have Charles Booker, the progressive, who has received a ton of momentum and support leading into this election and is looking like he may actually be able to defeat the heavy favorite Amy McGrath, which would be very interesting. And the question will remain to be seen: how much will the Democratic establishment back the progressive Charles Booker in this race and try to help him actually unseat Mitch McConnell, because you never really know. Now, obviously, what we have seen in recent days in these recent elections is that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is certainly picking up a lot more support, and you could argue is starting to gain more power within the Democratic Party than the more establishment and moderate Democrats. Now, that's certainly something to take note of heading into the elections as we go on into the year, and especially into the November general election. Now, moving on to a state that I actually forgot to label a little bit earlier, the state of Alaska I would label as likely in favor of the Republican Party. We don't have a lot of polling data going on over there. However, most forecasts consider the state a likely in favor of the Republican candidate, so I will label it as a likely for now. I'm still awaiting a lot more data coming in from the state of Alaska before I can really make an educated decision there. Now, however, moving on to the extremely competitive or more competitive states in this election cycle. Now, as for the lean states for the Democrats, there are 3 of them. We have the state of Michigan in favor of the Democratic Party, the state of Colorado, and the state of Arizona, all of which I will label as lean in favor of the Democrats. In the state of Michigan, Democratic incumbent Gary Peters is facing off against young and rising star John James in the Republican Party, who has a bright future ahead of him and came very close to unseating Democrat Debbie Stabenow in the 2018 Senate race in Michigan. He's taken another crack at it in 2020 against Gary Peters. It does look unlikely that he'll be able to pull it off, although he obviously is a bright spot in the Republican Party for the future. Obviously, he's garnering a lot of support in fundraising and in money contributions. However, to say that he will unseat Democrat incumbent Gary Peters in a state of Michigan where Joe Biden is really polling significantly far ahead of Donald Trump, all the way up to 10 points in the state of Michigan, and a state that he's expected to win, not to mention that Michigan is typically a more Democratic state than a Republican state, I do believe that Gary Peters will be able to hold on to that seat. Now, as for the states of Colorado and Arizona, we have an interesting Democratic primary in the state of Colorado. Now, John Hickenlooper looks like he's more than likely going to come out victorious in that Democratic primary. However, that's what we also thought in Kentucky with Amy McGrath. Now, obviously, the more progressive candidate, Romanoff, in the state of Colorado could pull off the upset if he gains enough steam and momentum heading into the Democratic primary there. But either way, I think both of those candidates will be able to unseat Republican incumbent Cory Gardner. He's obviously the most vulnerable Republican incumbent in all of Congress, you could argue, or specifically in the Senate. And I do believe that no matter who the candidate is from the Democratic Party in the state of Colorado, will be able to beat Cory Gardner. Now, as for the state of Arizona, we have Mark Kelly, the Democrat, who is picking up a ton of support in the state against extremely unpopular Senator Martha McSally in Arizona, who is looking more and more likely like any hope of her holding on to her seat is basically lost, as Mark Kelly continues to lead in nearly double digits in the state of Arizona, over Martha McSally. So that is why I labeled the state of Arizona as lean. Now we get down to the 4 states that I would label as tilt in the direction of either party. For the Republicans, I would label the state of Montana as tilt, and I would label the state of Iowa as tilt, as well as the state of Georgia as tilt for the Republican Party. In Montana, we have Steve Daines, the Republican incumbent, facing off against former Democratic Governor Steve Bullock in the state. Now, obviously, this is going to be extremely competitive given that Steve Bullock is a lot more popular in general than Steve Daines is. However, in a presidential election year in a state like Montana, where Donald Trump is expected to win comfortably, could Steve Bullock really climb over the edge? And that is the only reason I'm hesitant to label this as more of a tilt in favor of the Democratic Party, is because of the presidential election year. That also goes in the state of Iowa. Joni Ernst, the Republican incumbent, faces off against Democrat Teresa Greenfield. Now, this will be really interesting to watch because polls have tightened and tightened in recent weeks between these two candidates. Now, Joni Ernst looks a lot more vulnerable than she did a few months ago against Democratic Teresa Greenfield, so it will be interesting to watch what happens in the state of Iowa leading in. And as for the Georgia special election, now this will be really interesting because we have 4 candidates, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, all with a realistic shot at moving on to the runoff, which will in all likelihood take place on January 5th in 2021. The top 2 candidates it could be 2 Republicans, it could be 2 Democrats, it could be 1 Republican, 1 Democrat that move on to the special election. We have Republican Congressman Doug Collins. We have incumbent Republican Senator who was appointed by Governor Kemp in Georgia, that is Kelly Loeffler. And then we have the 2 Democrats. We have Matt Lieberman and we have Raphael Warnock. Right now, as things stand, my personal prediction is that we'll go to a runoff between Doug Collins and Raphael Warnock, the Republican and Democrat. I do believe that Doug Collins, as of right now, will hold an edge over Raphael Warnock in Georgia's special election, and that is why I've labeled it as tilt for the Republican Party. However, for the Democrats, I would label the state of North Carolina and the state of Maine as tilt in favor of the Democrats. In the state of North Carolina, we have Republican incumbent Tom Tillis facing off against Democrat Cal Cunningham. Cal Cunningham is leading in almost every single poll by very marginal numbers, and that is why I've only labeled it as a tilt in favor of the Democratic Party. It's a little bit surprising that he isn't polling a little bit further ahead of Tom Tillis, as he's actually losing in a few of these polls. Now, as for the state of Maine, we have Susan Collins, the Republican incumbent, who is extremely unpopular, even after winning multiple elections by extremely large margins in a state like Maine. For a Republican, which is extremely impressive, her support from moderate Democrats and the Republican Party has really started to falter now, especially among moderate Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents in the state of Maine. Now, this is really shocking. We've seen polls have Sarah Gideon, the Democratic candidate, polling further and further ahead of Susan Collins, and thus I will label it as a tilt in favor of the Democratic Party as things stand. Now, as you can see, it is completely split 50-50 between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, which would mean that it would come down to whoever won the presidential election, and their vice president would break the tiebreaker in the U.S. Senate. And that is all for today's video. This was just a quick little update on the 2020 Senate elections as things stand right now, taking polling data, historical trends, and overall likelihood and political leanings of every state and every candidate into account. So thank you guys all so much for watching, and make sure you like and subscribe, as well as turn on the notification bell so you can be notified as soon as the 2020 election night between Joe Biden and Donald Trump is live tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific time. Please make sure you hit the notification bell so that you are reminded as soon as it is uploaded. But thank you guys all so much for watching, and tune in tomorrow.